now go to turn this over to Pam and Jack, who are going to tell you some fascinating stuff.
Can you hear me? Is that on? I'm Pam Wilson. If we had a matrilineal society, I would be Pam Arledge. If any of you who have been around here a long time, I had a grandmother who was pretty well known in this town, who got me interested in history, and her name was Tootsie Arledge. She died in 1995. And so I've been working on Polk County history for many years, even though I moved away and I live in North Georgia now. But I've been working on family history because I'm related to almost every family. I still haven't found the Mills connection, but I'm connected to you in a couple of ways, so we're cousins. My grandmother, Tootsie, was a very fervent member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and so she would be turning over in her grave now if she knew what I was going to talk about. Because what I've done, as I've done a lot of historical research, is discover that Polk County was very divided, as were many of the counties in the western part of North Carolina, and even the central part of North Carolina. And it's not so much the way, what I've learned is that it's not necessarily like they were for the Union versus for the Confederacy, but there was a lot of gray area in the middle. It was a divided political climate, and it changed a lot during the war. As the war went on, even the political parties changed. Leaders like Zebulon Vance changed his party. He changed his position multiple times. He became the governor. There was another man who ran against him for governor named William W. Holden, who had started out being a hardcore Democrat, which think of the parties as being flipped from what they are now. So he was a Democrat before the war, but then once the war started, he became what was a kind of a formative Republican, and then became a Republican governor later after the war. So there were these tensions, these political tensions that went on. And a lot of the people who were not hardcore Democrats, the Democrats supported the secession and supported the Confederacy. And Columbus Mills, who is not, I know you're not your direct ancestor because he didn't have any children himself, but he was one of the many leaders in our county named Mills. He had a brother named Govan Mills. And the two of them were the wealthiest men in the county, along with, in that period, in the late 1850s, 1860s, along with Joseph McDowell Carson, who owned Green River Plantation. In the 1860 census, I found out only 1 out of 7 households had slaves. And even of those who had slaves, only about 6 or 7 families owned more than 20 slaves. And so Polk County was not a slave-owning county. There was just a very small kind of oligarchy that owned slaves and had a plantation economy. Because Polk County is on this geographical border between the mountains and the flatland, you know, it's really been divided in a number of ways through its history. And so this all contributes to the fact that there were a lot of people when the Civil War was starting to happen, when secession was being debated, who wanted to try to stay in the Union because their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had fought for the United States of America, and so they wanted to stay with that. And there was a party called the Constitutional Unionist Party. And most of us don't know that Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in the 1860 election in North Carolina. And neither was Douglas, actually. There were the Southern Democrats and then the Constitutional Unionists, which was later kind of morphed into the Republican Party. So there was a lot of political divide at that time. And what I've found doing a lot of research is, Jack and I have been researching this book for about 4 years now, that we're writing on, I guess it's on the Polk County Massacre, which I kind of discovered about 25 years ago, and bits and pieces, like reading Sadie Patton's book, and my grandmother said she heard something about it, and there was another Weaver family history that mentioned that some of the Weavers had been shot by the Yankees, but then somebody else said that they were Union sympathizers, and I couldn't figure out which was, how can you be both? So in doing research, I've discovered the estate papers, the estate files in Raleigh, which are now online, but at the time I had to go to Raleigh to find them, for some of my ancestors. Several of my ancestors were killed in this massacre. And I couldn't figure out why. And their wives led, and Jack's going to tell you more about the massacre itself, but this massacre took place in 1864 in December, just not long before the war was over. And basically these were leading citizens in Polk County. You mentioned the Williams family. The Williams family was at the core of this group, which I've determined were the more Republican-leaning, the anti-secessionists, the ones who didn't throw their support behind Jefferson Davis. They didn't want to go fight for the Union. They weren't trying to give up their Southern way of life, but most of them seemed to want to find a peaceful solution so that the North and South could be reconciled, so that the North would recognize the Southern way of life as something that could continue. But as Alan said, when Lincoln gave his inaugural address and aggressively sent troops into the South at Fort Sumter, for a few moments everyone was united in spring of 1861. But then after that, many of them joined the Confederate troops that were forming, but many of them also left, either resigned when they were able to resign and didn't re-enlist, or abandoned. They were deserters and abandoned their posts. So even within families there were conflicts. The George Williams family, George Williams was born in like the 1770s. He was an old planter. He owned a huge area of that Packlet River Valley that the Mills family didn't own. So it was the family, he was married to a Braden, and there was a man named Robert Braden who had gotten that land originally. So the Mills family and the Williams family really owned, and the Caruths too, owned much of the Packlet River Valley, which at that time was really the sort of fertile center of Polk County. And that was also along the Howard Gap Road, which was a very important path through the county, both for trade back and forth from the developing mountain counties down to Spartanburg, Greenville, Charleston. And it was also a path that many people hoped a railroad would go through. And Columbus Mills and his brother were very active in trying to get a railroad through the new town of Columbus, which was formed in 1857. The layout of that town as the county seat also brought in many people who were interested in being part of this county. So there was a man named Peyton Hunter who came from Spartanburg County, where he owned hundreds and hundreds of acres, but he came and bought up the majority of the lots in the town of Tryon, along with his son, Sam. He had a younger son, Charles, who served in the North Carolina 16th. He himself served in the North Carolina 16th. So it's not that these people were Unionists in that they wouldn't fight for the Confederacy or that they wouldn't fight for the Union, but there was something going on, and I wish I could go back and interview them as a time traveler so I could kind of figure out what they were thinking. But what happened was that Frank Weaver had come up from Greenville, South Carolina, had married George Williams' daughter, and Maholda. And then George Williams also had a group of daughters who married John Garrison, who you'll probably hear about, who was very active in the formation of Tryon. Also Jesse Rhodes, who was a very important leader at that time, and John Walker Hampton, who was the descendant of Andrew Hampton, who was one of the leading patriots to go back to the Revolutionary War, who was one of the real old families like the Mills in this county. Members of all those families, so in the massacre, 3 hunters were killed. Those were my ancestors. A weaver was killed. That's my ancestor. I'm not descended from the Hamptons, but the nephew, there was also a nephew of a grandson of George Williams, who was a nephew of Frank Weaver, was killed. And so, doing a lot of genealogies I do, realizing that these were all part of a family network who also shared ideological beliefs, has really helped me to see that not all my ancestors, even though I had been brought up to think that everybody was a Confederate by my dear grandmother Tootsie, I'm listening to her turn over in her grave right now because I'm saying this in Tryon, North Carolina, but that they weren't all diehard Confederates. And because they weren't, they came up against Columbus Mills, who was. And Columbus Mills brought in a ragtag group of home guard. They weren't official home guard, but he called in a bunch of people after his house was attacked by possibly deserters. We don't know, but he decided to blame his political opponents. And so this massacre happened, and I'm going to turn it over to Jack to tell you the dirty details.
My name is Jack Underwood, and like I said, I kind of came into this. I'm not related to anyone here. So I have limits to how angry the people to my right can get at me. To my right. One of the big points is, and y'all are wondering, is why this focal point is the reason that Tryon exists. In 1857, they were selling wonderful lots of land in downtown Columbus, North Carolina, new town, where the railroad was going to go. And they advertised that. Originally, the railroad was supposed to go through Golden Springs, South Carolina, to New Prospect, all the way up, and was going to wind itself around, very similar to how 26 now does. That is, it sounded great. The railroad had made it to Spartanburg in 1860. They had everything planned out, and then the Civil War came around. And there's a number of towns that if this had occurred, including Tryon, and that's what we're going to get to here in just a minute. Inman wouldn't exist, Landrum wouldn't exist. All these little towns that we know well weren't even wide spots in the railroad. I think J.B. Cleveland said that the only person living in where currently is Tryon is one old moonshiner. They stopped one time asking if they could get breakfast, and they said, I don't have any biscuit. Do you have any water? No, I don't have any water. And they started to turn away, and he stops and said, but I got a bunch of moonshine. You don't want any of that? That was his statement on the first person, the only person living here at that point. But as Pam said, by 1864, there were a lot of people that were really angry at the people that had gotten into the mess known as the Civil War. A lot of those individuals lived in this area and were finding the mountains a great place of hiding out instead of being sent up to Petersburg to play in the ditches and get shot at. A lot of these individuals had also had enough of the wealthy individuals that they personally blamed for getting them into this, so they decided to go on a couple of fun raids, including Columbus Mills, Bradford, Langford. It raided actually all the way down into South Carolina. They were going to raid the town of Fingerville, the community of Fingerville, but they got turned around before they did that. Columbus Mills had been in the Confederate Army. He was a surgeon. He had left in 1863, came back here, and was responsible for kind of herding some of the less interested individuals back into the Confederate ranks. And that didn't go over particularly well. And it was, I hate to say he had it coming, but he was wealthy, he was in their face, and he was also arresting their brothers, their husbands, their fathers, and sending them off to war. So early December 1864, his house is raided, and he takes it rather personally, requests probably some home guard from Hendersonville area who came down and were of like mind. So, the individuals that were being sought, and one of the reasons they were looking for him is he had lost some, one of the identifying factors that what we hear about was there was some cloth stolen off one of his looms that was spotted in a couple of these individual stores in their possession, either way, it was enough probable cause for him to finally come to the point he had had enough. December 30th, 1864, right within sight of the courthouse in downtown Columbus. Some of y'all might remember what was known as the Boxwood Inn. It's now now the fire department. But right there, a group of former soldiers, some citizens, showed up at the front door of Peyton Hunter, who was one of the leaders of this group. 6 of them had gotten together that nice cold night, including a couple of the sons who had probably come in out of the mountains. And they wanted to have a little discussion with them about their behavior, meaning that Columbus Mills wanted them arrested. So 3 of them, and there's 2 tales. One tale is the winner's tale, and one tale is the loser's tale. As you can guess, they're a little different. So the winner's tale, told in the newspapers contemporary at the time, was that the Peyton Hunter and his 2 sons came out into the porch. It's cold, and they were told they were going to be under arrest. Said, okay, let's go ahead and get our jackets. We'll be right with you. So they go in. They didn't mention they were going to come out with guns, and they didn't mention they were going to come out shooting. So Peyton Hunter has a knife, lunges at Columbus Mills, cuts through his jacket, saying, "I'll kill you, damn rascal," in which he was shot 7 times at that point. That didn't turn out well for him. His other son, his younger son, Charles, was shot and killed at that point, and his 3rd son was shot in the elbow and made his escape. There were 4 other individuals in the house that were arrested. They pretty much knew where Sam was heading, so they arrested Sam Mills, they arrested Frank Hunter, Sam, I get it now. Sam Hunter. We also have, trying to think.
Frank Weaver and Doc Hampton, who was John W. Hampton's son.
Yeah, another former Confederate, Benjamin Franklin Hampton. All 4 of these were captured, held at least a night over in the jail that was torn down a number of years back, and you can remember that. In the town, this was quite a source of discussion. One of the individuals was wounded in the attack, but he did survive. Columbus Mills was being asked what's going to happen to these men, and they were told they were going to be taken to Asheville for trial. They were taken towards Asheville. They did make it about 3/4 of a mile out of town, were tied to bushes, and therefore executed. They were left there. One of the things we was talking about earlier when they were talking about originally Ambrose Mills being hung. When a lot of times when an individual was killed in these situations during the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, that wasn't all to it. They were told they were hung for a reason, and y'all don't take them back down, or we're going to come back and hang you too. And there was some talk that this was kind of similar. They knew what had happened, and they weren't going to rush out and bring them back in. They eventually did. One of the tales has them laying in state in one of the houses, and they were still chained together and were buried that way because they could get handcuffs off by that point. So how that all ties around and finally winds its way up is Columbus Mills was on the hot seat after this by a number of individuals. And a couple of months later, a second raid or attack was held at the Mills home, which is where Mimosa Inn now stands. And Columbus Mills at that point managed to escape by hiding in a closet that was locked in. They didn't know there was a second door out of the closet. He went out the other door and made for the river. And they didn't lynch him like they wanted to, but they tried really, really hard. And about that time, he decided it's probably not the best place for him, and he thought, well, Spartanburg's looking pretty good. He had holdings in Spartanburg. And in summer of 1865, he was living in Spartanburg, eventually skedaddled back up to Cabarrus County, North Carolina, and really was not able to show his face down here again. Now, he had literally thousands of acres of very, very valuable property. That property he had to abandon, couldn't do anything with, and it started to look for a buyer. And at that point, we're going to pass it on and let those wiser about the exact buying process talk about that.
Thank you, Dr. So Columbus was no longer welcome in the county that he had founded, about 10 years earlier. He was responsible for combining Rutherford and parts of Rutherford, parts of Henderson County into Polk County, and they awarded him with naming the county seat after him. So, yeah, he was kind of chased out of town that night, but that was just the beginning of Pam and Jack call it a massacre. I call it a resulting feud because Weaver's wife in particular, how do you pronounce her first name? Mahalda Williams, really didn't take too very well to this. And so it kind of became unsafe for him to come back. So you can imagine after the war, the economy is really bad. He's got almost 4,000 acres going from Tryon Mountain all the way up and over Hogback Mountain. And I can't imagine that he was able to do anything with it in terms of controlling it. And I should imagine the people that were living on his old plantation were just trying to survive. And of course, he still had to pay taxes. So there was a minister, a Presbyterian minister up outside of Pittsburgh who had also done a lot of speculation in oil properties, developing oil properties that were used by oil companies. And of course, oil was the key to lighting back then. And he had, as his daughter described later in life, or his granddaughter, 10 children, half of whom were sickly. He had gone to seminary school in Pittsburgh, Western Seminary, Theological Seminary, with a gentleman by the name of Shotwell, and they became good friends. Before the war, Shotwell had moved down to Rutherfordton, and after the war, he told his friend about the climate down here, knowing that many of his children were sickly. So Leland McAvoy and his son, his son-in-law, Lemuel Wilcox, decided to take a trip down here, and they arrived in Columbia on July 31st, 1869. They came up here by a carriage or stagecoach to look around and meet their friend and see how the climate was. And sure enough, they really liked it here. And Columbus Mills would have had an agent here that negotiated with them. I don't think Columbus came back for it himself. And they settled on 3,880 acres for a total price of $15,000 on that last day of August, 1869. And it came out to something like $3.87 an acre. So they went back up to Pittsburgh, and Columbus Mills actually took out the mortgage with Lemuel Wilcox. Wilcox came back down the following spring with the first. It was divided into 3 tracts, and the first one was 1,680 acres, which went up Tryon Mountain, all the Backlit Valley, or at least all of the land that Mills had. And he began farming it, taking over the stills, taking over the tannery. He actually became one of the largest industrials in Polk County almost overnight. But he was a very modest man, and he was a civil engineer, and he set about trying to understand this area that he had just picked up. As Alan said, it was a pretty good bet. The railroad was coming somewhere through his property, either through Columbus and up the Howard Gap Road or some other route. So he also began working with the railroad as a surveyor and helping map that out. Very convenient. In the meantime, his father-in-law, Leland McAvoy, brought his family down, and they all came down by train, and one of his other sons, Lynn McAvoy, brought all the family possessions and everything by a wagon to make it down here, and they took over the old Columbus Mills plantation, which was not exactly where the Mimosa is now. It was about 150 feet away from it. It eventually burned down in 1916, but he turned his attention to thermal belt, which had just been first identified, or at least published, in 1861, the properties of the isothermal belt. So they moved down there. His family did, health-wise, they were feeling better. He took his evangelizing from the Presbyterian pulpit to the thermal belt and really started preaching this whole area. And he turned the Columbus Mills Plantation Home, which had become basically a stagecoach stop and a tavern in those years that it was abandoned by Columbus Mills, and added another story onto it. I think it had a total of 30 guest rooms. And he began publicizing this whole area all around the country. And so it started attracting Northerners and artists and the like down here. So while he's doing that, Lemmel is still working with the railroads, and he's also, as he's selling lots of land, he refinances the whole thing through his mother's family, who was the Fleming family. Is there anybody here from Pennsylvania? No, well, the Flemings, his father, Lemmel Wilcox's father, was at one time in business with Joseph Fleming. And the Flemings were basically the CBS of its day in Pennsylvania. So they were doing very well, and they were able to actually remortgage the property that Wilcox had purchased. And I can't be sure, it's one of these working theories I have, but the Fleming also, as well as selling, being druggists, they also bottled whiskey. So it's a theory that I have that a lot of that whiskey that was being made down here made it into Fleming bottles. And that's why I say that it was Pittsburgh drug and whiskey money that probably financed Tryon. So he continued to work with the railroad, continued to sell big lots of land. And in 1876, the railroad board met at the McAvoy House and heard the presentation from Thaddeus Coleman, who was the chief engineer on the project. And he had found this new route going up the Saluda grade, saved 7.5 miles and a lot of money. And it just happened to go right through here. And so the board approved, and they moved forward on this route, and almost immediately thereafter, Lemmel Wilcox deeded over the right-of-way for the plan, for the route that they had found. And then he set about surveying this particular downtown area and created a map. Basically, he designed a town around the railroad coming through. And that map is remarkably similar to what we know of Tryon today. You'll be able to see the map or copies of it downtown tomorrow. But all the familiar things are there: Trade Street, Pacolet Street, Oak Street. He laid out all the storefronts, and some of those have changed a little bit. He actually had a storefront where Maple Street is now, and there was a street behind that was called Hickory. Now it's all Maple, but it's amazingly similar to what we ended up with. And then, so he began, as the railroad was building its way through, he began selling these lots. And he sold, where we're sitting right now, he sold to a guy named Virgil Cornelius Dibble. These 4 lots that we know between Melrose, Pacolet, Chestnut, and what was Walnut, he sold those, there were 4 1-acre lots, and he sold them to Dibble for $40. And the lots across Chestnut there were 3 lots, and he also he did have Melrose Avenue actually going all the way down the hill to meet up with what he called then Depot Street. And he sold those to John Garrison and his son-in-law, T.T. Ballinger, and he created what was then the Tryon City Hotel, and it eventually became Oak Hall Hotel. So Tryon really began shaping up at that moment in 1876 that the railroad approved this route, and he didn't waste any time in getting it to what it was. I'd like to note that we actually have here in our audience Lemel's great-grandson and great-great-granddaughter, Keith and Fran Grady in the first row. Who have managed to hold on over all these decades, much of the Wilcox treasures and some of the land, and we're very, very honored to have you guys here tonight. So, but I want to step back a little bit to this massacre. What's really notable to me is that the massacre was just a very brief moment in time, but if it had not been for that, and if it had not been for Mahala, I get that right one these days, Mahalda Weaver and her vendetta against Columbus Mills, it is very possible that this area, just like many of the rural areas in the South, would have just slowly developed, and we may just be sitting on a farm right now. So that one pivotal moment, that massacre, is really what made the difference and why we're here today. The railroad asked McAvoy's wife to name the town, and she decided to name it Tryon. The people that were attracted to Tryon because of McAvoy's evangelizing of the area included the Erskines, the toy makers, Vance and Gale, I'm sorry, Carter Brown. Carter Brown never would have been here probably if it had not been for the atmosphere that Leland McAvoy had created in attracting everyone down here. That the countless number of artists and writers that came down here was just unprecedented, and really accounts for what we have today. And speaking of the weavers and the toy makers, Julia is going to go into a little bit about how the whole crafts story started here, and how we ended up how we are.
One very important point is the date that Lemuel Wilcox bought the property from Columbus Mills was August 31st, 1869. Exactly 150 years ago tomorrow. This is why we call it our 150th anniversary and/or Founders Day, or sesquicentennial, which you almost have to sing. You can't even say it once fast.
And if I can say, this kind of came about us, on us pretty quickly, and as Julie came up with just an amazing celebration for this whole thing. It's been pretty quick, so thank you all very much for your patience. And we are sorely absent some critical historians on the stage tonight, as everything was such short notice. But as you enjoy this weekend, the sesquicentennial, please realize we had a choice. We could either attack it with vigor of the Keystone Cops and try to make it happen, or we could ignore it. So
Guess which one we picked.
yeah.
Very quickly, in about 1904, Ellen Vance and Charlotte Yale, who had met at Moody Bible College in the Northeast, they were both from Connecticut, worked for a little while for Jane Addams at Hull House. It's true of almost all the arts and crafts artists of the era, beginning really in the 1850s in England. All the arts and crafts folks were basically short social reformers at heart. And a great number of them had the interest in training young people to give them skills to have a better life. In rural anywhere in this country, you basically had two choices in life. It was either the mill or the farm. And so that's one reason that when Miss Vance and Miss Yale came south because of Miss Yale's mother's ill health, and because the area was known as having a salubrious climate and a very restorative one, they came to Asheville. Miss Vance was a master weaver, Miss Yale a master weaver. They started a Boys and Girls Club at the Episcopal Church in Asheville. Edith Vanderbilt caught wind of this, where she, in spite of all her wealth, was really a social worker at heart. And she said, this needs to be a real enterprise, and so she backed it. And that was the birth of Biltmore Estate Industries, later shortened to Biltmore Industries, that produced some of the finest woolen material hand-loomed in the country. They regularly shipped material to Saxon Avenue to make very fine ladies' suits. Another thing that Miss Vance and Miss Yale did, because they loved all children, they would have a Christmas party every year, and that one of the things they made a point of was they wanted to include the children from the east side of town. And many of us have heard of the east side, or they've heard of the upper road and the lower road. And the upper road is Markham, and the lower road is Howard. But I'd like for Dr. Fox to sort of take over here and tell us a little bit about that community and the activity that went on there, which is extraordinary.
Thank you, Julia. So I'm Joseph Fox, and grew up here in Tryon. Most of you that have lived here for a while probably know quite a few of my family members. Roy Berry was my uncle. Mamie Fox was my aunt. Hazel Fox was my mother. And William Fox, Bill Fox, as most of you know, is my dad, who just turned 91 about 2 weeks ago. And so a lot of family history has come along through talking with my older family members. The Fox family, as we know it, moved to this area, and they first settled in the Howard Gap area. And then later, and that was Ernest Fox, who was my grandfather, who married Iona Berry Fox. And then the family moved from Howard Gap to Tryon. The Fox side of the family moved to Livingston Street. The Burns side of the family moved to Peak Street in Tryon. My grandfather, Ernest Fox, lived in Howard Gap for a number of years, and then my father, Bill Fox, and his sister, Catherine Kennedy, bought some property very close to the Equestrian Center out in that area that we actually still own, and then we still have the family home on Peak Street. So as I was growing up here in Tryon, got to see the community develop. And Julia mentioned East Side, and so those of us that grew up on that side of town just kind of laugh because we never called it the East Side. That was a name that was given, I think, about 16, 17 years ago when the East Side Citizens Advisory Committee was formed. And that committee was formed, which I have been on that committee since its inception, to discuss the services that side of town was receiving or not receiving in most cases. And so it was a way to keep the citizens from storming town council with complaints. And so the Citizens Advisory Committee was formed so that the citizens could come to us, discuss their issues, and we would be the liaison with town council. So as Julia mentioned, we grew up knowing it as the Low Road, which was really Peak and what is Vaughn now, and the High Road, which was Markham. As we look at the history there, couldn't find really any data representing whether or not redlining was occurring in Tryon. But I suspect, very similar to other towns and cities, that Tryon was affected by redlining. Redlining was a practice that grew out of the financial industries in the United States, where literally folks would take a red marker or red pen, and they would divide the town, the city, the areas into either the red zone, which was high interest, high risk communities, and that's where most of the communities of color were funneled to, or it would be the green line, which were where you had your better schools, your banks, your homes, etc. And so as you see the divide in Tryon between the communities, you saw the community of color mainly on the east side of town, and that's where that name came from. When we were looking geographically and looking at representation of citizens, it became known as the east side. And so, again, couldn't find any data around was redlining really occurring in Tryon, but very similar to other parts of the country. That's how the communities were first set up around race and ethnicity. And then as that occurred, you saw the communities of color develop their own churches, their own businesses, their own community centers. I wear several hats when I'm in Tryon. I'm on the vice president of the board of directors at Roseland Community Center, which was founded in 1940, so a little over 79 years old. It's the oldest African American institution here in Tryon. Also, am a member of St. Luke's Assembly Church. St. Luke was, and its Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, was organized in 1817. At that time, it then developed into Old St. Paul Methodist Church in Columbus in 1893. As folks wanted more, and that area, as I have been able to find, was along 108 near where St. Luke Hospital now stands. As that land became kind of popular and people wanted that land, the black church was encouraged to move more into town. And Mr. Erskines and a couple other folks were instrumental in funding the original move of St. Paul, which then became St. Luke's Assembly Church, to Wilderness Road at one point. And then it was moved to Markham Street and built in 1935 in its present location on Markham Road. It was rebuilt in 1967. And so as we're going through the history, we see there was a divide. We also, politically, we also see there was a divide racially. And so you had the low and high road community, the black community of color, forming their own shops, their own businesses, and part of that grew out of the culture and sentiment of that time. So in early 60s, you still had a feeling of segregation. Even when we were beginning to integrate the schools and Tryons, and that was done in phases, you still had some services that were not on the black side of the town. I remember being in the first or second grade, probably second grade, before the actual school bus, the public school bus, came to that side of town to pick up folks. So if you were a resident, a school child during that time, this was probably 66, 67. Prior to that, folks were going to Emory School, Emory High School, which was the black school at that time. You either got to, if your family didn't own a car, you took a cab to get to school, or a family member that had a car would give you a ride, or you would walk to school. And so that was an experience growing up until the school bus started coming to that side of town. We had a number of businesses that sprung up in the community. So when you talk about community development and community needs, it was out of community needs, because Main Street was not a place during that time that looked favorably on people of color coming to Main Street. So if you came to Main Street and you were a person of color, you came, you did your shopping, you got what you came from, but you knew not to stand around. I did a presentation at the Historical Museum, Tryon Museum, a few weeks back, and I shared one instance of, I guess I was probably in high school at that point, or middle school, I guess, and myself and Steve Cannon, and you may probably know the Cannon family, were, well, for the longest have been the black-owned mortuary that was started in Landrum and now are also in Emmon, but going to Orange Pharmacy that had a little counter in there, purchasing food, and Steve had first ordered and paid and was given his change back, and it was not correct. And so just the mere fact of questioning the change being incorrect set a very hostile tone. And they corrected the change, threw it at him, looked at me and said, you know, are you going to order anything? And so, you know, here he's ordered and he has his food, so I thought, well, I can either order and have food or say no, so I ordered. So there was still a disconnect, and so you saw more and more businesses on the east side or the low high road start because of that. So we had a number of grocery stores, we had a number of beauticians. Most of you probably remember Carol Lee Massey and her sister. We had James Payne and his taxi company. We had Bud Payne and his taxi company. We had Fred Lyles, who was one of the earlier owners of a grocery store that then became Bryant's store. So just a number of businesses that grew up on that side. At that same time, and again I mentioned that Roseland was founded in 1940, we also had a community center that became the hub of the black community. Roseland has a really interesting history in that it is not funded by the town of Tryon, which is a misconception that the board has addressed on several occasions. You know, unlike Harmon Field, and at that time, blacks were not really encouraged to come to Harmon Field. It was not a friendly environment. And so we had the Roseland Community Center, we had what is now Ziegler Field, but Roseland, the town of Tryon, as I understand, owns the actual land, and the board owns the actual building. Unlike Harmon Field, when you look on your tax bill, there's a percentage of your taxes that goes to support Harmon Field. Roseland was never included in that. And so Roseland has always had a working board that at some points, sometimes we had to go into our own checkbooks and write checks to keep the insurance there, to keep the power going. And we relied on grants and fundraisers. So the east side has always been very self-sufficient, very similar to many communities of color, out of necessity.
Joe and I were talking earlier, and we were talking about Nina Simone. And I asked him if it was sort of widely known when she was young that how gifted she was. And I'm going to let him pick up on his story about Nina Simone.
Okay, so Nina, and most of you know her name was Eunice Wayman. Her dad and mother, the Waymans, were here in Tryon, and actually My family had a very close connection with the Wayans. Once they moved from the birthplace of Nina to over Jackson Street, they owned a little grocery store, a little convenience store, and my siblings and we all worked for Mr. Wayne. And so our family were already connected from back then. And then being a member of St. Luke, we grew up with Nina playing the piano as a very young age for the gospel choir. So the community was very supportive of her with fish fries and church dinners, etc. When you read her history, you often hear of a piano teacher, doing things for her. But it started with the community realizing how talented she was, the church realizing how talented she was, and a lot of times that piece of the research is not mentioned. As she grew up and became older, and the other connection that I have to the family is her sister Frances married my cousin Marcus Fox. So Frances Fox, her sister, who is still in Atlanta and comes to Tryon very often, married into the family. And so our family were very connected. I've heard that Nina left and never came back until the very end. That's not true. That's a misconception. I'm not sure where that came from. Nina and my mother was very close friends. And I can remember late 60s, her visiting, the first visit that I can remember her coming back. I remember this lady that was in late 60s, very grand, very Afro-eccentric, with Afro bell bottoms, coming, and we were all kids playing in the front yard. And one of my older cousins, a couple of the older cousins said, "You know who that is, don't you?" "No, that's Nina Simone going into your house." And so I know that she came back on several occasions. Her mother's funeral was at St. Luke, and she came back for that service. And another piece of that history is her niece, my cousin, is Crystal Fox. And some of you may be aware of Crystal. Crystal played the black police woman in The Heat of the Night. And then went on and is now playing Hannah on The Haves and Have-Nots. And still comes in and out of Tryon. So to answer Julia's question, the community was always very supportive of me.
Okay, we're gonna wrap up the Talking Heads portion of the evening. We'd really like for anybody that has any questions to please speak up. I will throw one teaser out there, and I will ask somebody to answer one question from the audience. And who knows what structures were built along the Governor Tryon boundary line when he struck the treaties with the Cherokee. Francis.
What?
We're talking about the blockhouse and the Earl Street.
Right, okay.
And of course, the blockhouse was pivotal as a defensive fortification during the Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War. Thank you. Alan, please, anyone that has any questions, please speak up. Yes, Alan.
I've often wondered why it was called Polk County.
After James Polk, after the president.
From the 1840s.
James Knox Polk.
Yeah.
From the he was what? He was
In the-
president. Anybody can tell me what years he was president?
In the 1840s.
1840s. So it was named in his honor. Anybody else, please speak up. Got a lot of information tonight, I know, but Tryon has just an amazing story. We're very lucky. Yes, ma'am.
This question is for Robert, please. Robert, I was having a conversation a couple of days ago, and you were there also. We were talking about T.T. Ballinger, and my great-grandfather purchased the Mill Scriven plantation from T.T. Ballinger, And I said, he was the first mayor of Tryon, and you said, nope, not exactly right there. So,
That's
have-
right.
okay.
Look.
Clear that up and don't yell at me, just clear it up.
Did everybody hear the question? Frances is making the point that she was talking about, she and Robert discussing T.T. Ballinger, who has basically been known as the first mayor of Tryon. And T.T. and his father-in-law, John Garrison, were the ones who built Tryon City Hotel, which became Oak Hall. And Frances said that she was talking with Robert, and Robert said, well, he wasn't exactly the first mayor. Robert.
Okay. When the town was chartered by the state in 1885, it was chartered as a town of Tryon City. And Ballinger was named the mayor. However, I haven't quite figured it out yet, but for some reason in 1891, the state rechartered the town from the town of Tryon City to the town of Tryon. At the time, I believe Ballinger was a state senator, and the charter actually names the government, and it named a very, very close friend of Ballinger's as mayor. Dr. Charles Kentworthy, and then there was an election held 2 months later. So the first mayor of the town of Tryon was actually Dr. Charles Kentworthy. And then Ballinger was elected in the election that followed in May of that year in 1891. So Ballinger was first mayor of Tryon City, then Kentworthy, the town of Tryon, and then immediately after that, Ballinger was the mayor of
I heard you all took notes. There will be a pop quiz.